Kansas picked up its most improbable victory since ... Kansas State showed true grit in Starkville, and Mizzou has a chance for a make-good victory this weekend. Columnists Vahe, Gregorian, and Sam Mellinger are here to break down the current state of college football on SportsBeat KC, the Kansas City Star's daily sports podcast presented by Big O Tires. Later, Sam and Vahe offer prospects for a new cornerback for the Chiefs and consider the idea if the Chiefs even need to go there. It's Tuesday, September 17th, and we're talking sports in Kansas City. Thanks for listening. So I'm flying to Oakland, and I'm watching the Kansas State-Mississippi State game. And first of all, let me just say, I'm not so jaded that I don't – that's kind of a neat thing, right? You're 35,000 feet in the air, and you're watching a college football game, and when there's a little buffering, I get ticked off. You know, it's like, I mean, how spoiled am I?
Airplane Wi-Fi has come a long ways in the last couple of years. It used to be a lie, and now it's mostly legit.
Well, to your point about being ticked off about that, I'm sitting across from Sam McDowell on my flight out, and we're watching the game, and I look over at one point, and he's like 4 plays ahead of me. So I literally put my hands up to the left side of my face to not be tempted to look over there because I didn't want to just get to the end. I wanted to see how it happened.
Isn't that typical that young buck Sam McDowell, technologically savvy Sam McDowell would be 4 plays ahead of you?
Just in life and in general, yeah, that's true.
All right, so I watched the game. It's a great win for Kansas State over Mississippi State, and right at the end of the game, there's an ESPN graphic that this was the first time, I think since 2006, that Kansas and Kansas State beat FBS opponents on the road. And I looked at that and I considered, I said, hey, don't do that to Kansas State.
Right.
Right. Kansas State's pretty legit, has been legit ever since then. Kansas is the one that makes this a graphic.
It is. It's a little like I combined with Henry Aaron to hit 755 home runs, right? I mean, pretty much that's all on Kansas.
Well, yeah, it's the first time since 2008 that Kansas had beaten an FBS school on the road, and the sun came up the next day. Like you can play this game as much as you want.
That's true. And so let's start with the more improbable of the outcomes this week, and that would be the Jayhawks as a 20-point underdog going to Boston College, falling behind by 10, and then ripping off whatever it was, a 41-7 run in this game, which is just remarkable. Remarkable that nobody saw it coming. Although Jesse Newell told me earlier this week that the Sharps had an idea. They actually bet the line down from a couple of points, right? It ended up 20. I think it started the week at 21.5 or something, and by kickoff, it was 20. So there must have been some sign of hope in that loss to Coastal Carolina a week earlier that the Sharps saw.
Hey, well, to just turn back to Jesse for a second. Last week we were in here in the office talking, and I was sort of joking around with Jesse about what how ridiculous the score would be the other way, and he's like, the way Boston College plays, I don't know that Kansas could win, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's a game. And Jesse tends to see things through the mist a little bit that sometimes I don't, and maybe others don't.
Well, if he had any kind of premonition, he was spot on. And I know that there was a thought even of not even covering the game. Why would you even send a reporter to a game where the conclusion was inevitable? And this is why you do it. This is why you cover games.
That's right.
On the road. So it was a remarkable victory, and it was. Let's try to put it in some sort of perspective. Nobody saw it coming, and what does this mean for Les Miles going forward in this program? They play West Virginia at home on Saturday, and we thought before the season this was the best opportunity for a conference win for Kansas. Things look different for the Jayhawks now.
Sure does. I mean, that's a chance to go 3-1, right?
3-1
with 2 wins over Power 5.
Yeah, Power 5 programs.
I don't know. Nobody. If anybody tells you that they know what this means, I think they're a liar. I remember when Turner Gill lost to South Dakota State and then beat a ranked Georgia Tech team the next week. Turner Gill's time at Kansas did not end well. I do think, but I don't say that to dismiss what they did on Friday or to say that it doesn't matter. Of course it matters. At the very least, it's a bump. It's some confidence. It's a good talking point for Les Miles and his staff to sell on the recruiting trail with, I don't think one game, either way, a bad loss or a great win, can swing a recruiting class. I'm not saying that at all, but, you've got the first signing date in almost exactly 3 months, right? Every little bit helps, but you got to back it up. And this is a great opportunity. This is the opportunity that you'd want if you could draw it up.
There have been some victories for Kansas football in the last decade. Not many at all. In fact, fewer than any FBS team, I think. But there was a victory over Texas in 2016 and a victory over TCU last year. And I remember the Turner Gill win over Georgia Tech. One thing I remember about that game was it was Turner Gill's first year, so Mark Mangino had been the coach the previous year, and Kansas had not fallen off the cliff at that point.
Yeah.
There were still players recruited by the Mangino regime. Of course, most of the team recruited by Mangino. There was no reason to you couldn't see the next decade from the victory over the loss to, I think it was North Dakota State. They lost in the opener that year.
Was it? Okay.
And then beat Georgia Tech. It's almost like, okay, they righted the ship that night and that day, and things will be okay. And of course, they were never okay after that to this day. So, Vahe, can a program get more than a short-term bounce from a triumph like this? Understanding that when you talk about Kansas football, it's unlike anything else on the college football landscape.
It is, and for the very reasons you just outlined. But I do think there is it's some kind of combination of momentum and foundation and trajectory, right? You have a chance to do something, build off each. There's a bit of a continuum, right? I mean, often you see that in hindsight more than you can see it in foresight. But I think we've said this each week with Kansas, and I think it holds just as true now. That first win, the way the Jayhawks won, that swings the pendulum forward. Then you have it go back the other way. I think the important thing right now is that there's a little bit of traction, and each week will change the next. I don't know what to expect Saturday, though, right? You think they've got the bump and they've got a little bit of juice, big home game, winnable opponent. But I wouldn't be surprised to see it go the other way. I just think it's going to be a little bit like that in this period. But I think right now you can say it's obviously a net positive with what Miles is doing. And that's really all you need to know right now. I mean, this is going to be a long-term situation anyway.
I remember last week talking about how all the capital he'd built up over the first 10 months of Les Miles' tenure was blown in one game, the Coastal Carolina loss. And especially that sequence of 3 timeouts, 2 by KU to set up a whatever it was, a Puka Williams run up the middle on fourth and 3. So
an utterly predictable and hopeless Puka Williams run up the middle. That was thing was going nowhere.
Right, and so at the time I remember believing, well, that moment could very well define the season. So if nothing else, what Friday's win over Boston College did is it at least takes that moment off the table as a season-defining moment.
Yeah, and a program like Kansas cannot beat a program like BC without having some additional positives come out of it, right? To achieve something like that. But my thought was exactly what you just said. The fourth down play with the 3 timeouts, to me, was so discouraging because it showed disorganization and just a lack of creativity, a lack of, just searching for solutions. And then what the hell happens the next week? They drastically change their offense and do something that BC just was not prepared for or looked like considered might happen. They spread them out a little bit, a bunch of RPOs. I mean, it was beautiful. I mean, wide open receivers, wide open running lanes. I mean, and that's the kind of thing that I think a lot of us thought Les Miles is going to bring. The Coastal Carolina, maybe that's the blip. Maybe that's the outlier. But it just, for that 1 week, it was like, ooh, maybe we were completely wrong about the coaching chops, not just of Les Miles, but all of his assistants, and then come back with a really, really, really strong performance. That, to me, that specifically, we've talked about that's a marathon. That's a marathon rebuild. But little signs like that, can give you some optimism that it's got a chance at least.
Well, I think a lot of people believe Kansas would be 2-1 after the non-conference portion of the schedule.
That's right.
And here they are.
That's right.
Kansas State had a great victory. And to go into an SEC stadium and win is a real triumph for Chris Kleiman and the Wildcats, and something that I think back on Kansas State non-conference scheduling in the last few years. Bill Snyder had the reputation of not playing anybody in the non-conference, but that changed in his second term as the Wildcats coach. They played Auburn and UCLA and Miami and Vanderbilt in the last few years, but hadn't won one of those games. Remember, they went to Vanderbilt a couple of years ago and got beat, and Auburn beat them in Manhattan, and Mississippi State just rolled over the Wildcats last year in Manhattan. But Saturday, even with Kansas State fumbling the ball and committing penalties, Kansas State pulled out a victory that has to be admired. And Kansas State had done what you'd expect them to do in the first couple games against opponents that didn't match up well against them. Unlike other programs, they did what they were supposed to do, and they followed that up with a pretty impressive road victory. And does this change the way we think about Kansas State going forward?
I think it does. I do think those first two games, it was what you said in terms of they did what they're supposed to do, but maybe I'd give it a tick beyond that they demonstrated being locked in, right? They played through. And hearing, whatever you want to call it, it's sort of a coaching cliche, right? But playing with one heartbeat or whatever, they look like a team in each of those games. So it gave me a feeling that they'd compete against Mississippi State. I certainly didn't expect that win, and I do think now you have to ask yourself, all right, look at Kleiman's whole profile. Look at the energy he's brought in. Look at what they've done so far. To me, you've got a testimony here that his way certainly lends itself to this level, right? And I realize that again will be a long-term point of analysis for almost the opposite reason of Les Miles, right? It's okay. You come in thinking you do this, but can you do it with your guys over a long period? But I think you have to feel really good about it. I think if you're a Wildcat fan, heck, this is kind of not just encouraging, but I think energizing and refreshing. And I do think, look, there was a lot of feeling of consternation about Bill Snyder's period coming to an end, but I think we're seeing, you didn't have to think that we've got to stay stuck's probably the wrong word. It's probably unfair, but stuck in that place. That was sort of not no man's land.
Right.
I thought the biggest questions to me going into that game from K-State was basically about toughness. And, Blair, you just mentioned that game last year, and that was a mismatch. That was an absolute physical mismatch. And so when I say toughness, I mean physical like that to stand up to that program in their house physically, but also mentally, and be able to forget about last year or not forget about it and use it. But either way, produce a different outcome. And not just that, but look, no team is ever perfect in any game. But, they had some special teams mistakes. I know they had the long kickoff return too, but they had some special teams mistakes. They, there were some moments where, your toughness is tested sort of mentally. And, all the way up to the quarterback it was a fourth down, right? And he just goes the dive and, the super Elway helicopter. That was such a cool play. And, and it was a great effort by him, but also a great effort by K-State to get over there and make the play. So I just, those two things, I thought that was the biggest test. And I was willing to be impressed with K-State even without a win. If they played them tough and it just came down to, they hit the field goal at the end or whatever. But to win like that, they were the better team. They were the tougher team. They were the more physical team. They could not have been more impressive.
No, I agree. I really didn't expect them to go down there and win. Last year's game was etched in my memory. The way Kylan Hill ran all over him, and the Wildcats got pushed around. So, yeah, I think my perspective on the possibility for Kansas State changes with that outcome. And they've got a big one coming up. They're off this week, and then go to Oklahoma State, which is off to a terrific start. Look, I don't know if surprising, but Oklahoma State's picked up a couple of road wins this year. So that's you go into a season and you try to project the way things might fall, and you look at programs with new coaches and kind of downgrade them a little bit because of that. But one thing Kansas State had going for it that West Virginia didn't, and Kansas at the time we didn't think had going for them, was a returning quarterback. Skylar Thompson is quite an advantage for K-State. And when you've got somebody who's as experienced and has been as successful as Skylar Thompson, and a coach who has won as often as Chris Kleiman, maybe that's a little bit of a combination that got overlooked in the preseason.
Yeah, that's a good point. And look, I think in here, in our room, as they say, I think there was a general feeling of, yeah, he's got to show it, but I don't think we thought this was a bad hire. I mean, I think I liked the hire. I liked it right away, and but you can't always make the conversion. You don't know how to treat that conversion when it comes right down to it. And things like Skylar Thompson, those are sometimes the bridge that makes it come to life in a different way. It'd be interesting to see what it would look like with an inexperienced quarterback that was just learning the ropes.
I think Missouri has an opportunity this weekend, hosting South Carolina, to remove some of the bitter taste from the opening game loss to Wyoming. Now, I also thought that Missouri had a good chance to have a great record long into their season and be undefeated. That obviously was rendered impossible after the opening game. But in South Carolina, the Tigers Tigers have an opportunity to prevail over an opponent that has caused them a lot of frustration over the last few years.
Yeah, for sure, and it's sort of been a Barry Odom. I don't. What's bugaboo mean? It's been
a hex. It's been South Carolina has been a problem for Barry Odom.
It has.
Barry Odom has a South Carolina problem.
He does. And Sam, you saw it in living color last year out in Columbia, South Carolina.
It was agonizing.
Crazy game, but kind of a botched game.
Totally blown game for sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
And in a way, that's been I think the telling part of Barry Odom in non-November games, right, is games like that. I mean, I think, 10-2 in November, and otherwise, And so I have a little different feeling about this team, and I had that feeling before the Wyoming game, and certainly was like, well, that's big trouble. I think they need this game, Blair, to make up for the Wyoming game, and then you feel like you can dig in and believe. It's part of this 5-game homestand, and if they'd beaten Wyoming and lost this game, maybe you'd feel better about them in a weird way. But if it plays out this way, well, that's what you want. You're on the uptick, and you've got something going. So I'm really looking forward to this. It is a bit of a statement game, I think, for where the program is. Yeah,
look, if they lose to South Carolina, their victories will have been over SEMO and a West Virginia team that's starting over with a new coach. Now, look, West Virginia had a nice win over NC State this past weekend, but still, a 2-2 record after 4 is not what anybody would have anticipated with the Tigers. I remember that, Sam. I remember you were at the game in South Carolina last year. The game that disappeared in the rain for a quarter.
Yeah,
I mean, you couldn't see it on TV. There was so much rain.
Yeah,
and that not Drew Lock's better moment.
No, and they blew that as a team too. And it's worth pointing out that they got some bad breaks, both with the weather, kind of ruining some momentum that they had, but also, there was a play. Did they say that Roundtree stepped out of bounds, or there was a long run that got called back on a very, to me anyway, like questionable penalty. So that's a bad break. But then Mizzou just collapsed after that, And look, you can't. It's not how many times you fall; it's how many times you can't. You get up, and you can't control the breaks that go against you, but you can control what you do when those things happen. And that was the failure in that game. But it's the thing that strikes me about this game is it sets up for a huge overreaction either way. Doesn't it? Like, no matter if Mizzou...
Which is why I'm going there to right.
Yeah, exactly. Like, whether Mizzou wins the game, then, Wyoming's over, and SEC win. We've exercised the South Carolina thing. If they lose, it's just like all, it just, either way, it's a beautiful thing.
One reason I'll listen back to this podcast is to tape those words of yours and stitch them in up high in the column, whichever way it goes.
Well, and Alex Schiffer has already given you all the column points earlier today, so we're really appreciative to the Schiff man for that. All right, let's take a break, and when we come back, we've got some Chiefs to talk about.
Save big on the biggest brand tires. Where else? You're participating Big O Tires. Now through September 22nd, get up to $70 off select sets of Michelin and BF Goodrich brand tires. Plus, get up to an additional $120 in mail-in rebates on qualifying purchases using your Big O Tires credit card. Only at Big O Tires, the team you trust. Not valid with other offers. Disposal fees extra. Up to 10% shop fee based on non-discounted retail price. Not to exceed $35 where permitted. For the store nearest you, go to bigotires.com.
Hey, it's Blair. Hey, we have a special subscription offer for SportsBeat KC listeners, unlimited digital access to the Kansas City Star's award-winning sports coverage. Sign up now for 1 year of Sports Pass for access to all the sports news, features, and columns we have to offer. And it's only $30. That's a 40% savings off our regular rate. For your convenience, your subscription will automatically renew after the initial term at $50 unless you tell us to cancel. A lot of subscription services won't tell you that. They'll just sneak it on there. We just told you. Your subscription helps support the sports coverage of kansascity.com and the Kansas City Star. Please visit kansascity.com/SportsBeatKC offer to get this special offer. And as always, thanks for listening. We're back on SportsBeat KC with columnists Vahe, Gregorian, and Sam Mellinger. And guys, I'll run down some names of some cornerbacks. You give me a yay or nay on their prospects of becoming Kansas City Chiefs. Let's take Minkah Fitzpatrick off the table. That would be a nay,
do that,
right? Wait, was that a surprise, by the way, going to the Pittsburgh Steelers?
I don't think I like that trade from the Steelers. Like, I think there's a lot of value in Fitzpatrick because you're getting him for basically 4 years and at a super cheap price, not just the rookie contract, but the Dolphins already paid him his bonus. So you're just on the hook for the base salary. The cap number's incredibly low, but maybe the Steelers, for sure the Steelers have a lot of pride, so they may not want to admit it, but that could end up being a top 5 pick, depending on how this season goes. They don't have their quarterback.
Now, right?
They're already 0-2. I don't know. That could be a really good deal for the Dolphins. And Fitzpatrick is a really good player. He's versatile, he's talented, he's cheap, and he's under long-term control, so he's a valuable player. I'm surprised that the Steelers did that deal.
Just a quick question on that. Were the Chiefs, do you think, in some way in on that, thinking about it? How I know I think you're writing about this, but to what degree do you think they just couldn't offer enough or couldn't offer enough fast enough? Or
Exactly. That's the way I understand it. They were, I don't know what the right adjective, aggressive or they were in on the talks. And, but, the problem with having Patrick Mahomes on your team is that your draft picks aren't worth as much.
You're never going to draft high.
Right, so they theoretically, let's just say they offered a number 1 and Pittsburgh did, and you're like, well, we could get a top 10 pick out of the Steelers, and the Chiefs won't be.
Yeah, so to me, and I don't know what the Chiefs ended up offering or were willing to do, but to me, a first-round pick from the Chiefs would be worth it because it's going to be, you would think, somewhere after 25, somewhere between 25 and 32, and you fill your biggest need. I think that would have been a really, really smart deal. But once the Steelers come in, if you look at that draft chart about like the point value on each pick, and I did this morning, and just conservatively say that the Steelers, that pick's going to end up being 12, just, conservatively. The Chiefs would have to give up their next 2 first-round picks, or, their first and either that Niners second that they have or their own second, and 2 more picks, their first and 2 more picks. So that price gets really high. And, there's a certain point where it becomes not worth it, especially when there's other yay or nays to talk about, which I think we're about to do.
We are. We're getting to our next cornerback, and that would be Jalen Ramsey, who we just saw a week and a half ago in Jacksonville not have a great game. But I wonder if the Chiefs did a little observation during that game, a little up close and personal scouting on Jalen Ramsey. So, but he's out there, he's available. Yay or nay?
Well, because I think there's somebody in this room better informed than me.
Stop it.
Even though you turned to me, I'm going to say nay. But I do think, I want to just expand a little bit on your point about whether the Chiefs did some scouting. I do think, we've had different reactions to different things at different times with who they've brought in. But I do think if you really look at the modus operandi with how guys they bring in, they're paying attention to how they're going to fit in the locker room culture. And I emphasize the locker room part because sometimes, we've had questions about, broader statements to community, et cetera. But I think, Sam, you're better equipped to speak to that than I am.
Yeah, I think it'll end up being a nay, just because I think there's some teams, I don't know if I can say most, but it's, more than one. Like, I think there's teams that would cross them off the list just because, not just the potential locker room disruption, but that price. Jacksonville's not going to give up a 24-year-old, 2-time Pro Bowl, at the height of his powers, and you would think going to stay there for a few years without getting, I would think, 2 firsts, and not 2 32nd overall firsts. I think they want a big price, and they should. And Jalen Ramsey is also, it's going to come like sort of the Frank Clark package, more draft capital, but also you're going to have to make him. And look, the cornerback market has sort of stalled. It's plateaued for a while, but he's going to be the highest paid cornerback in NFL history. That's the kind of talent and the kind of timing. So I think there's some teams that kind of look at, the Jaguars had this guy in the same way that, star quarterbacks don't really switch teams often. Star cornerbacks don't really switch teams that often. And so if they're not doing it, there must be a reason. And so I think it'll end up being a nay. I think the Chiefs will continue to monitor, and maybe it changes if Jalen Ramsey's willing to play and, without a pick, or I'm sorry, without a contract extension at the end. I don't know that he'd be willing to do that, but what if he was? Maybe does that change? Because then it's not just about the potential disruption versus the price, or, the potential disruption and the price versus the production, but now you take out the price. Is that, you have a little bit more control over the guy too. He's not empowered by the contract. There's a lot of moving parts there.
It's a funny thing about what makes the sweet spot,
yeah.
though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about it and describing it exactly, but it's a floating thing. I mean, if something can be obtained at X price,
yeah.
then maybe you're a little more braced or willing to accept whatever that downside is on some other aspect of it.
Yeah, there's 2 ways to look at it, right? Because I do think, and I know that the Chiefs think, that they have a pretty good locker room, a really good locker room. And, so there's 2 ways to think about that. One, we've got a really good locker room. We can put our arm around this guy, sort of the Patriots have been known to do a time or two. Or we've got a really good locker room. Why would we risk screwing this up? And, that's a gut call. Like, that's not something that, there's really a formula for. So, how strong is Patrick Mahomes' voice? How strong is Frank Clark's voice? Tyron, that's the kind of things that you have to go through.
Did the Chiefs not have a good locker room when Marcus Peters was their star corner?
Well, that's the thing too. They just did this. Was it 2 years ago? Mm-hmm. Traded and they play the same position, and they're the comparison is natural. I don't know. I really liked Marcus Peters. He was good for us. He was entertaining.
He was good for us, especially you.
I thought he was honest, but I get that he was also a pain in the ass. And I obviously don't know Ramsey the way that we saw Marcus Peters up close, but that comparison is there, and I could easily see The coaches are all different, but Andy or the front office being like, we just went through this. Why are we doing it again? I could see that.
Well, it's an interesting question, Blair. The way you asked it, I took it as, maybe Marcus was whatever Marcus was in that locker room, but did it really affect the locker room? And I remember actually each of us in some way working on a different story related to that and kind of getting the feeling that he was actually well liked in that room. Mm-hmm. There was some concern, I think, from management at some point, though, that over time, if he kept, for instance, not doing what the coach wanted him to do on defense, and kept, in some way or another being disruptive is kind of a funny word, but I think he was certainly that way with some of his antics. I think that's reasonable to say. Yeah. Then at some point, he becomes more of a leader than you want him to be in those ways.
Yeah. I think there were two other like kind of main things going on there. One is, he's not here anymore. I don't want this to be like throwing dirt on the guy, but Bob Sutton, one of the criticisms when he was here too was sort of there wasn't the same level of accountability. That's one thing that they really liked about not just Spagnuolo, but the coaches that he would bring with him, and not just accountability in the sense of wagging your finger and look, player, you do exactly what I say, but accountability between the coaches, just an overall, sort of tidying up a little bit. And that didn't exist. That same structure didn't exist. And the other part of it, and this would come into play with Ramsey, Marcus was getting to the point where, he was going to have to get paid. And, it's one thing. There's a lot of examples through all sports, baseball, football, basketball. I don't follow hockey as much, but I'm sure the same in there. But, money doesn't change who you are, but it brings out who you are. And, I'm waiting for that opportunity. Yeah. To show your true self.
Because it's not bad. I think it's okay.
Yeah, I don't feel like I know you at all, Blair.
But you know what? Like if we've had this level of issue with the player when he's making, his rookie contract, what's that going to be when he's on one of the biggest deals at his position? I think that's a legitimate concern.
Okay, final candidate, Patrick Peterson. Yay or nay, and has that, the prospect of that response changed over the last few weeks?
Yeah, I think that's a big old yay. But the problem is the Cardinals have to say it's a yay.
Yes, that's right, but it was a definitive nay in the preseason.
Yep.
The Cardinals said no way.
Yep.
And I still think that the Cardinals are they haven't given up on the season after 2 weeks either. They've got a loss and a tie, and who knows? They might think that their season has potential.
Yeah.
Although they're in a division now with 3 other teams that are 2-0.
Yeah, and those 3 other teams are all really good, but. Look, like there's an argument to be made. If the Cardinals GM came out and said, you know what, like I get we're not going to make the playoffs this year, but Patrick Peterson is, and this is his reputation. He's a a good teammate. He's all those things, and we want to keep him as an example, for these other guys. There's logic in that. I tend to look at it a little bit more coldly, I guess, and just think that he's 29 and you're going to pay him $12 million the next year, and that's money you can use other places, and what if you get a second round pick for him? That's another player. That's how I would tend to look at it. But I think that's a big old yay. I think the Chiefs would say that's a yay as well. But you got to convince the Cardinals.
I'll just jump in and say between the nay or the yay, that's a firm A. I think so. Right? Why not? Why wouldn't it be? Why wouldn't the Chiefs try to keep that alive and sort of monitor?
Well, is it worth remembering that the Chiefs in 2 games this year held Jacksonville to 13 points in the first 3 quarters, and basically that game was over after 3. And this past weekend held the Raiders to 10 points in their stadium with each of the boundary corners coming up with an interception, and the slot corner coming up with a sack in that game. And, oh, by the way, in 2 weeks, Mo Claiborne is coming off the suspended list and will be a part of this, this secondary.
Just real quick, too. I mean, that's a good point to make. I thought Bashaud Breeland was terrific the other day.
Certainly much better than he was the week before.
Yeah.
And I'd like to see what his final grade was.
He was physical, in the run game, which
Yes.
not used to seeing corners,
Yeah, I agree.
tackle like that.
And on the dirt, too. That was even when he was bringing a guy down hard on the dirt.
Yeah. And that interception that he had, he played that perfectly, just expertly. That ball, it was a stupid audible by Derek Carr. And part of me saying that because I freaking hate the end zone fade. It's such a cop out and it never works. But anyway, but Breland played it perfect. That ball was never complete. That ball was always an incompletion or an interception. If you look at the angle and the way that he muscled up a little bit, he played that absolutely perfectly.
It is worth remembering that those guys seem to be playing that way. And it's so far so good on that, right? And I think that's important. I don't know what we think Claiborne's going to bring, but the whole dynamic of this that's interesting is when are the supposed reinforcements really going to be available, at what price, if that really happens? Let's say Peterson's the one in play. Can the Chiefs afford to try to wait before they sweeten any pot on anything they are thinking of? I guess they can afford to wait, but I am reminded a little bit of just thinking about the Royals in 14 and 15 and making those moves, even when, like, I guess it was 15 was Obrist, right?
And Cueto.
Cueto.
They were both that year, yep.
And at that point, you're thinking they've just gone so all in. They've decided they're pushing every chip in. And I don't think we yet have that feeling about the Chiefs. We know that Brett Veach, the general manager, is very aggressive. Very aggressive, I think, is probably a fair way to put it. So it would seem sort of in his wheelhouse to be ready to push the envelope here. But why would you do it unnecessarily either if you feel pretty good about where you're going?
Yeah, it's got to be the right deal, but it's a really interesting thing too, because if you look at the cornerback market, like, first of all, if they're going to be drafting, just say 30th, I mean, it could be anywhere 25 to 32, but like, that's not where you get star corners. Like, those guys go before that. DeAndre Baker, this was widely considered a weak cornerback class. DeAndre Baker was the first one taken, and he went 30th. The Giants took him 30th overall. So the Chiefs could have had DeAndre Baker. DeAndre Baker, I just looked this up. He has given up 11 catches on 13 targets for 272 yards and 2 touchdowns, according to Pro Football Focus. He's just getting torched. So even if you get one of these talented kids, like, they might take a while, And whereas Patrick Peterson has been in this league, he's had some success. There's nothing that he hasn't seen. So there's a little bit of, an instant bump there. But one other thing too, those in free agency, Steven Nelson just got $9.5–10 million a year. Aaron Colvin got $35 or $40 million. I forgot however, like what that worked out to per year. But the Chiefs, those guys are hard to find. Like, this is the path in a lot of ways. This is the avenue to get these guys, to acquire these guys. In a lot of ways, it's the Chiefs' only chance.
Biggest opportunity or challenge for the Chiefs in the first 3 weeks comes Sunday in the home opener against the Baltimore Ravens, with Lamar Jackson, who became the first player in NFL history on Sunday to I think this is the stat, rush for at least 120 yards and pass for at least 250 in a game. So. Or maybe it's 270. But anyway, he surpassed some threshold like that. And
I think it's in a regular season game. The only reason I know this is Teresa Kaepernick, Colin's mom, retweeted that she begged to differ when it was referred to as a first, and that apparently Colin had done it in a playoff game.
How about that?
Was that the Packers game, probably?
I think so. I think that's right.
God, that was a lightning bolt.
It was unbelievable.
Oh, my God.
Oh, my God, yeah. Yeah, nobody wants that guy.
Right.
Oh, my God, he was terrific. So. Okay, and we'll talk more about that the Chiefs-Ravens game on Thursday at Facebook Live at Big O Tires on 151st Street. Looking forward to that with Sam Mellinger, Vahe Gregorian, and Sam McDowell will join us there. So for today, thanks, guys, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Blair.
Links to the stories we discussed are in the show notes on kansascity.com, and Chiefs stories can also be accessed through the Red Zone Extra app. Hey, and we're on YouTube on the Kansas City Star channel. And if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, please take time to rate and review SportsBeat KC. Big shout out to Bruce Pun, Human Torch 101, and Dalvin Minero, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, for their kind words. Thank you. And as always, thanks to producers Kathy Lou and Leah Becerra. Hey, do you know it's Patrick Mahomes' birthday, right? It's also the big day for Evan, Kathy's son. Happy birthday, Evan. And we'll be back tomorrow for another SportsBeat KC podcast to talk sports in Kansas City.